Welcome, Michael.
Well,
Um,
thanks for having me.
I wanted to make sure we had a podcast where I got a chance to talk to you because you're going to be here in Portland in about a month, and you're going to do the first ever meditation workshop that we've ever had here.
Hmm.
And I've gotten a bunch of questions about it already from my own students. What are we going to be covering? Are there going to be yoga, all kinds of different questions. So this is a good chance, I think, for us to answer some of those in advance and let people know what's kind of going on about it.
Mhm.
Um, Before we start, I wanted, because not everybody may know who you are if you're not part of SBG, give you a chance to introduce yourself. And before we even do that, I just want to add a disclaimer in here because you and I have been around the kind of in years past, decades past in my life, kind of around some of the spiritual scene, for lack of a better word, Advaita Vedanta and the meditation and the Buddhism and all that. And incorporated in that, a lot of times there's a lot of bullshit. There's a lot of, just pie-eyed
Yeah.
people. And in contrast to that, this is just straight up because I think this will help people pay more attention to what you're talking about. You and your wife opened up SBG Texas. So you came and you've been a longtime student of Coach Frankel, John Frankel in Korea. And you came and did everything right and learned our procedures and everything, went and opened up Texas. And I don't know, was it like the week you opened or a couple of days after we got hit by the COVID lockdowns?
Yeah,
Yeah,
3 weeks after,
3 weeks.
about 3 weeks in.
The absolute worst possible scenario for anybody to imagine. And I'm not going to say anything else other than this. You guys managed to flourish throughout that. Your gym is kicking ass. I've been there a couple times in the last 2 years, doing great, to the point where you and your wife just bought your building, which is something we always recommend to all the gym owners in SBG and everybody else that's paying attention. So you are a very pragmatic entrepreneur and martial artist. So
Thank you.
I just want to put that out there up front so people understand who we're talking to. But having said that, let's start with martial arts. When did you start martial arts and how did you meet Coach Frankel?
Um, I can say that I had a definite interest in martial arts going back to really the old kung fu movies and things like that. Like I was watching all those in high school, and then at that point if anyone had approached me like, hey, I know something, I would have been interested to learn. But it was a little bit different era, end of the 90s. I grew up in Iowa. Like it wasn't like it was martial arts on every street corner or something. And I guess I didn't really know what I was looking for either. I did get opportunities to try a few different things. I ended up my life took some interesting turns by most people's standards. I lived in Germany for half a year doing a teaching internship on a military base. Kind of caught a bug there for traveling and living in I guess exotic locales, and ended up going and moving to Japan for 2 years. While I was there, I was exposed briefly to Aikido, and I had an absolute great time at Aikido class. I really, really liked it. I was on the other side of Japan from where I lived, visited my friend. He took me to his Aikido class. I absolutely loved it. I had such a good time. And then that just kind of faded in the background. I started watching the UFC. From Japan, I moved back I was in St. Louis for half a year, and some people had like a UFC party, and I started watching that. I really thought it was incredibly exciting, and it reminded me of watching boxing with my grandmother when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And when it used to be exciting, like the Mike Tyson era. And when I moved to Korea after that, so just for reference, I ended up staying in Korea for 13 and a half years. So I lived in South Korea. Most of that time was in Seoul. And I started hosting UFC parties. And a guy came to one of my parties and said, hey, the university up the street, they have this. You could do this up there. It was actually the university I was working at the time, and it's the university that John Frankel works at. And I went there, showed up, and basically got my butt handed to me, and I was utterly stunned at the efficiency. It was just a couple of purple belts, but I just couldn't believe how easily they manhandled me, like just so effortlessly. And it didn't occur to me till many years later. I actually thought about my Aikido experience where I was incredibly I had such a good time. So I was really indulgent, I guess you could say, towards like the sensei. Like he'd be like, "Hey, grab me like this," and I'd like really intricately grab him exactly the way he wanted me to. Not a lick of aliveness there. I had no interest in resistance, and he would still struggle to do things to me. It wouldn't be like very automatic that he'd flip me or something like that. It would take him like 5 tries or something. And I thought that was awesome. And then I was forced onto a mat with these guys, and it was like, touch hands, bump fists, and it's like I didn't wrestle growing up, but I did wrestle in Iowa. Lots of people. There was a lot of fighting growing up, and like I thought I could handle myself okay. And it was more like if I touched them, I was going to get put in an arm lock, and that was sort of it was like they were like just everywhere. You didn't want to put your hands on these guys. Like it was just they would reverse it, and I was using every bit of aliveness against them, and they had no difficulty dealing with me. I remember just thinking like these are like the real ninjas of like this is like mystic lore here, like what these guys can do. Like this is the real thing. It's like, and all I could think is I want to be these guys. Like I want to be able to do what they're doing. Like, and just kept coming back from there. And that wasn't even John. I met John probably 3 weeks later or something, and John's classes were amazing. And I've got all my belts under John Frankel. I've been training under him for 15 years, I think 14 or 15 years, something like that. So
the guys you started with there and that experience you just told me about, those were John's students.
those are John's students, yeah.
So he has quite a few black belts now, doesn't he? Probably has.
Oh yeah, all the guys that were beating me up as purple belts are like black belts now. So,
and he was the first. Give him a little credit while we're talking about this.
Sure.
He was the first guy to bring Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to Korea, wasn't he? South Korea.
Absolutely, yeah, totally.
Quite an accomplishment. So that's your Jiu-Jitsu background. Your meditation background, I didn't know. I knew you had one. I didn't know as much about it until I was visiting with you recently in Texas, and we talked more about it. But you have a really long history with this. And, one of the questions a couple of people have asked is what this has to do whatsoever with what we do here at SBG and martial arts. And I'm going to let you speak to that, but I will mention that in my book, where I cut out everything that I didn't feel was very important. And yet, if you look in there, there's still a chapter, a short chapter, tiny chapter, but there's a chapter on meditation. And so it's important enough that I felt it belonged in a book on violence for everybody. And my instructions in that are super simple, basic, generic mindfulness application, and then encouraging people to look into it themselves. But so I think there's always been a practical connection there, and somebody that wanted to understand exactly what that connection could be, they could always reference that. But when did your background in meditation start? Where did it start? How and how does that relate to your connections to India?
So the meditation thing started from a relatively, I have peculiar stories there, but like it did start at a kind of young age for me, unbidden. Nobody told me anything. I remember at a very young age, I would start just closing my eyes and going with my feelings, basically, just very innocently, like 7 or 8 or 9 years old. I remember really enjoying the experience and kind of coaching my older brother to have a similar experience. Like, I did it in a very innocent way, and I was having these kind of very joyful experiences just sitting there with my eyes closed. And that kind of just fell into the back burner as I got older. And I do remember very briefly, like it was like a commercial for like a National Geographic or something on like Tibet or something. And they're like, masters in Tibet have made a science out of meditation or something. And I really caught my eye. I don't think I got to see the show. It was just a commercial, but that commercial really stayed with me. It was like, oh, like that thing that I was kind of doing, there are people who have done it and kind of understand it. Like they've studied it or something. And I was probably like 12 or 13 at that point in time. And when I reached high school, I actually started kind of actively looking for books. But again, this is like the late 90s. I mean, it's so different from now. The word yoga was still pretty exotic to a lot of people. I mean, in the Midwest, I don't know, maybe if you're out in California, maybe quite different. I know my experience, and it was, pretty hard to come by. I remember reading a really terrible book on yoga that I think is awful advice on everything. But when I went to university, I just kind of got lucky. I went to like a Tai Chi thing looking for meditation. Didn't get it. I got like a Tai Chi guy that smoked 3 packs a day and was like just reeked of cigarettes, and he could have cared less about any of that aspect of it. And it was so goofy what we were doing there. In retrospect, I don't know what it makes the Aikido look amazing, to be honest. But and then there was just a girl in my dormitory that I thought was cute, and she was like, "Hey, are you going to go to this like yoga session?" And I said, like, "Yeah, sure." And I just like, "Yeah, sure," mostly to just like talk to her or something. And I went in, and it was Dr. Lloyd Pfluger was giving a kind of lecture on it, and he taught a workshop that weekend, and I was all in. I loved it. And Lloyd is very accomplished in that field, and he's been in all of it, every last kind of movement. He knows about it, thinks about it. He's studied mysticism. His PhD is in comparative religion, but his focus is like mysticism and various traditions and stuff like that. And anything meditation, mystical oriented, Lloyd knows it. He lives in a little cabin in Missouri, and his cabin walls are just books of mysticism and meditation. And I would suspect, about as learned as you could find a person to be on that subject. I don't think there's a thing you could bring up topic wise with Lloyd, and he wouldn't probably know more than you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you'd think you'd know about it, and then he would actually have read every book on the subject. It's his PhD, like this is what he does his work on. And I studied under him for years. And at that time, I was very involved with like the Art of Living Foundation. That's a group based in India, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. I went on to become an Art of Living teacher. I worked with them for years and years and years. They're a nonprofit, and very spiritually oriented. I think at one point, the head teacher for South Korea or something like that. I can't remember what my title was now. I taught meditation and yoga to, let me think, Franciscan monks. I think it was Franciscan. I can't remember which brother. I think it was the Franciscan monks of like Seoul, South Korea. And I worked with that for quite a while. And then I just kind of, I wouldn't really say I like hate the organization or anything. I just kind of fell out with it. Like, it was not anything like, there were no controversial things or anything. Everybody was always great. I still love the organization. I'm in contact with lots of people with it. I worked for them for, I don't know, maybe I suspect somewhere around 12 to 15 years in like a nonprofit capacity, teaching people yoga and meditation. And I just reached a point where I started focusing more on my career. I was a professor at the time, teaching like public speaking and debate in Seoul. I was a father with children, and I just decided to stop making the time for it to go and teach that. And all around that time too, I had now taken up jiu-jitsu, and I was falling ever more kind of in love with jiu-jitsu, I think, relative to the yoga and meditation stuff. But I have, since around the age of 18, I'm 43 now. Since the later part of being 18, I've meditated every day, twice a day. I don't miss a day. I think I've missed like one meditation or something in 20 years. Like, I just don't, it's a part of my routine. I get up, I meditate. Somewhere in the afternoon, I meditate. Like, you've stayed with me, you know what I mean? Like, I'll just say, "Hey man, I'm going to go meditate." And I'm gone for 20 minutes or something, and I pop back out. And like, I've been doing that I've been doing it for so long that to not do it would feel like, I don't know, not brushing your teeth or something like that. It would just feel kind of odd. But yeah, that's basically my background and how I got into everything. And yeah, I was just really fortunate. People like in jiu-jitsu, I was fortunate enough just to come across a great jiu-jitsu teacher. In the course of meditation, I was just fortunate enough to come across a great teacher, and I think some people come across great teachers and they just let that slip through their hands. I feel like I've been pretty lucky that when I've been blessed with some great teachers that I showed up, listened, and we've talked about it. There's no magic to success on some level. It's more just like show up, do it, put in the work, and you get the results. So
Right.
meditation is just like that with jiu-jitsu. So
So for people who don't know, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, not Ravi Shankar, the famous musician, the Ravi Shankar you're talking about, who runs the Art of Living Foundation. Talk to me a little bit about that style of meditation. What is it? What are its roots? Where does it come from? Obviously, it's Hindu based, but
yeah, so that's actually pretty interesting. This is something I only really delved into and learned within somewhere in the last 3 or 4 years. But so the tradition of yoga itself has very little to do with bending and stretching. Like if you start talking back and you want to go into like 1,000-year frame of reference, it has very little to do with bending and stretching, if anything at all. It's really only the last couple hundred years, and that's more because it's a marriage of the physical culture movement in the early 20th century with some of the older philosophies of yoga and stuff like that. And I don't mean that in any way to disparage asanas and bending and stretching. I think those are all great. But just factually, if we're talking like, if you say like yoga's 2,500 years old, which I think is a pretty reasonable date. You could argue older depending on what you mean by that, but the oldest traditions are all about the mind and meditation, and that the forebearers of what we call yoga would have been relative contemporaries of like Buddha and Mahavira and stuff like that. And so
yeah,
all of these people have a concern with the mind. And in the case of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar and like some of the lineage that I learned through, I really like lineage. I find it interesting. Trying to think of how to break this down. It's been a little bit since I remember reading about this, but there are certain sects that actually can be traced back a decent amount. And so Sri Sri learned from Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, I can't think of his teacher's name, but he's usually affectionately referred to as like Gurudev. And he was one of the last of the Shankaracharyas of like the South or whatever. And it's actually one of the longest traditions of it's a little bit related to Hinduism and stuff like that, Shaivism and stuff. So like there are these Shaiva, like Shiva worshiping or Shiva oriented traditions that actually go back quite a bit, very focused on meditation. Shiva typically depicted as like kind of the god of yoga. And that Shaiva tradition is quite old. And I only learned this recently. I didn't learn this through Sri Sri or the Art of Living. I learned it through just a totally alternative academic source. That Shaivite tradition, Gurudev was kind of like the last of that, and he passed a lot of that on to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who passed it on to Sri Sri Ravi Shankar and stuff. And Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was the guy that taught the Beatles meditation and really put meditation on the scene for the world, but was not particularly popular in India. So not that he was like unpopular, but he didn't have the same impact in India that he sort of did in the rest of the world. And then Sri Sri kind of followed up on that. And initially, I would say his movement and the group of people that he worked with were people like Lloyd Pfluger, whom I learned from. He was one of his first one of his first students. Lloyd and a lot of those people were people that had come from TM, Transcendental Meditation, which is Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's group. And they had kind of fallen out with TM over the years. And a lot of them came to meet Sri Sri, and they were very impressed with his skills, his ability, and particularly his focus on breathing, in addition to the meditation. And so yes, Sri Sri kind of got rolling a lot with like Westerners, and then later started having a much bigger impact on India. And now like the Art of Living Foundation in India is it's like the big yoga organization. Like when I traveled through India some years ago, if I were to tell people that I was like a student of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, particularly if I would tell people I was a teacher, like, or essentially ordained by him like a teacher, it's like doors start opening and people give you like a free meal, and like they start to really treat you in a very different way. I didn't really do that to like grease wheels or anything. Just people would ask me questions and it would come out just authentically as a reasonable answer. And then one of the things I really found fascinating with Indians is like, despite me being this like, white boy from Iowa or whatever, like if I say I'm a teacher from Sri Sri Ravi Shankar or something, people are like, I have a question for you. Like they have like deep and sincere questions for you, and they're very just not racist. I was stunned by it. Like how, I mean, I found it actually super uncomfortable because people will like ask for your blessing or something like that. And I don't view myself that way. So I don't really want to like lay hands on people and like, try to cure their arthritis or something. Like, I mean, like I'll do it. Like if they really ask, okay, I'll put my hand on you. Like it's whatever you want from it. I'm not going to be like a jerk about it. I'm pretty sensitive, but like, it's not like I'm going around selling it for $5 a touch or something, right? So
There's
yeah.
there's no bigotry from them in the sense that you have to be Indian in order to carry on their own tradition, which is actually quite cool, I think. In a way.
I was utterly amazed by that. Like that blew me away. I just would never have expected that. And I'd say that's very much at odds with most cultures that I've experienced in the world. Most cultures, like I lived in Germany, I don't think if I came and told them I had the secret to making sauerkraut that most people would be eager to hear me, like pretty much they just shut me down, right? Like,
Well, let's get to the practical part of it. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that you meditate a couple times a day, every day, and you've only missed one day for forever. How long do those sessions last you?
for me, about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Usually about 20 minutes per session. Some days are longer, some days are a little shorter if I'm really busy or something like that. But I generally keep it around that ballpark. I could do more. I think also being practical. I mean, it's like you could meditate and stretch and now work out. Like you keep always adding improvement things to your day. But at some point you have to do things during your day too, not just improve on self. So I think 20 minutes or 10 minutes twice a day, or even 10 minutes, I would say whatever time people put into it is going to be worthwhile time. As long as you're still taking care of your responsibilities in life, it's good, right?
Yeah. I had a conversation years ago with a friend of mine who also spent more than a decade in India and has spent
Wow.
lifetime doing meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And his basic overall point was, and he was advocating for the long-term Vipassana retreats where you go away for, a week at a time.
Sure.
And his theory behind that was, the analogy he uses, you get two sticks and you rub them together to create a fire. You've got to go a long time to eventually build up this resistance and this heat. And then all of a sudden you get the flame, and doing it a little bit at a time, the meditation a little bit at a time, you're not going to get the same effect. Now,
sure.
Having said that, since that time, since we had that conversation, he himself put out an app and has a progressive meditation, a progression, which is actually really good. It's Sam Harris. He has this app.
Oh, sure.
He's put it out.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that a little bit in the book, and I was thinking about that. And my conclusion with that is very much just like it is with exercise. One of the reasons why I would never put out, like people will ask me what I'm doing for exercise. People get so hung up on routines and trying to find the perfect routine, and the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And the reality is, if you do something every day, if you're just doing push-ups every day, you're going to get stronger. And that consistency is the key. And so in the book, I encourage people, you set the timer for 3 or 4 minutes if you need to begin to practice meditation. Because as you know, it's actually very hard. And for some people, it's one of the hardest things they'll ever do. And maybe there is some truth to what Sam was saying, that there's certain states of mind or consciousness that you may or may not be able to achieve without these long-term periods. But that doesn't negate the value of doing a little bit at a time.
Right.
And so when you're doing a little bit at a time like this, you do a little bit in the morning and you do a little bit in the afternoon. What exactly do you feel you're getting out of that?
Well, I want to talk to 2 points there. I'd like to return to Sam's point because I think he has a super valid point, and that would actually be the point of the workshop that I'm doing.
Okay.
Is actually to basically, yes, like when we can dive a little deeper, you can get a lot more done, and there is something special to that. As for what do I get every day with my practice, I mean, it is a way to basically hit the reset button.
Mhm.
That's kind of, I mean, that's what I call the workshop, is the mind body reset.
Okay.
And I think the best analogy that I've come up with for what meditation can do for you, I think it can do a lot of things, but it seems to be the case that at this point, with most of our computer technology, that the best way to fix a problem with your software, like you have an app that's not working, your computer's not working, is you reset the computer.
Right.
And when you reset the computer, lo and behold, now everything's working. Like we just had an iPad at the gym and like it was stuck in landscape mode or something. And gosh, we tried every button to unlock it and it did it. We just couldn't. And it's like, you know what? Let's just reset this. As soon as we reset it, no problem. So
Right.
that's kind of what I would describe meditation as doing for you, is like you're actually hitting the reset button. Sleep is supposed to do that for you, but I would argue that somehow it just doesn't quite. I would say sleep is more like when you let the computer idle or something and it goes into like, I don't know, screensaver mode. I feel like these analogies can sometimes get away from themselves at some point, but it's more like, yeah, you're like saving energy. You're like in battery saving mode, but you're not actually resetting like the operating system, right? Whereas like meditation allows you to actually reset the operating system. And a lot of things that maybe you know, a lot of times there's something like something upset you, you know, like, and of course you relay that to someone else. You're like, this guy said something, it pissed me off, and someone's like, oh man, just let it go, it doesn't matter, which is of course good advice, but sometimes it's like somehow you can't take the advice. And that's actually a big theme of my workshop, is kind of like your mind is not really, your mind is not under your control, not in that entire sense, right? Like that's why people suggest that meditation is hard, because you're suggesting the idea of calming and slowing down thoughts. And when you simply ask your mind to do that, your mind doesn't do that. Your mind is very peculiar and has a very strange relationship with your sense of self. These things get more complicated as we talk about them, but like, I don't just direct my mind to do what I will it. It doesn't do necessarily what I will it to do. It often works in opposition. And what we find with meditation is like you hit the reset button. And when you hit the reset button, it tends to be the case that your mind works more in unison with what you want it to do at that point now. Like that thing that you couldn't let go of, that you were like, I can't stop thinking about this thing that someone said to me, it upset me or whatever. And it's like all the pithy wisdom that you can come up with doesn't seem to stop the mind. The mind's like, yeah, but, and it just keeps throwing it back into your general state of consciousness. And when we actually start to bring the mind back to kind of its deepest points, it's like you're hitting the reset button. Everything gets a chance to kind of shut down. The operating system reboots, goes in its the order that it's supposed to go in, basically. And now it's very suddenly you're just very, you might not even remember that you were upset about that thing. Now, sometimes something is very, I feel like I'm stuck on like a computer analogy, but I'll do my best. I feel like it'll break down at some point, but just like with jiu-jitsu, when you find analogies, but you get some malware or some actually like targeted bad software that got in and is trying to do damage to your mind. Maybe somebody really truly upsets you, or just dealing with emotions themselves are just very difficult things. They are very, very ancient things. They are like thoughts are, I suspect, thoughts are a relatively new evolutionary trait. To take feeling and craft it into what we think of as thought, like, which is a very nebulous idea. It can be words, it can be images, it can be sounds, it can be smells, it can be a lot of things. The thoughts as we think of them, that I think is a very human capacity, and I think it's very new. Feelings, on the other hand, I think are very old, and these things tend to be a little incongruent. You can change your thought pattern, but not get rid of a feeling. Versus what I've typically found through years and years of meditation and working on these kind of things, that if you can change a feeling pattern, which is where meditation tends to be very helpful. If I can change the feeling pattern, I'll have a better ability to actually change the thought pattern. I feel that thoughts are like feelings are like waves, and thoughts are actually like crests, the very like tips of that wave. I think that's what we're doing as humans, is we're pulling thought, like these kind of mind things, so to speak. It's a hard thing to talk about. There's kind of better words sometimes in Sanskrit for this, but like there are mind things that go on in our consciousness. We all know them when we close our eyes or even just summon the concept of thought and mind. But they are somewhat differentiated. Like feeling and thought are very much interrelated, but they're not exactly the same thing. And when we can kind of learn to wrestle with feelings and learn to deal with those, we'll often be able to change thought patterns that are more pernicious or just won't go away, right? So I have things that I teach on the workshop for dealing with, very basic kind of mental, you have something going on in your mind you don't want there, but it could be very minor. And then we have ways of talking about dealing with things that are very major, right? Like certain feelings are more profound based on certain experiences. That being said, one of the things I do say about the seminar is it's not personal. I will not know what happens in your mind. I do not know what you're going to deal with. I'm not your therapist. I'm not there to provide a therapy session in some sense. I'm there to provide you with tools that will help you to sort through your own mind and like deal with your own stuff. Like you don't have to air anything to me. We won't have any sessions where, I mean, I'll listen like after a session or something. If you have a deep and profound question, I'm not going to turn people away, but it's not like, hey, everybody tell me what's in your mind. Like, I don't need to know that. I don't want to know that really. I want you to have tools to be able to deal with it yourself. And I think that's, one of the great gifts that I was given is like, just having these tools to be able to be like, man, I'm really upset. And upset could be angry, sad, grieving. It could be lots of things, and like having tools to navigate those feelings and in no way denying their experience, in no way am I like, it's not like I don't get angry or I don't get upset or don't get stressed, but like having a way to bring them to closure with a really high success rate. That's what I think meditation can really help you with. That's what I try to teach on the workshop. Very, very practical. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant, but I was thinking back to your initial comments about the spiritual stuff. And this is something I actually thought would be kind of fun to talk about with you even, but just I don't even know what that word means anymore. No, I like people like I
don't like to use the word, but sometimes it's the best descriptor of the kind of paradigm that we're talking about.
Sure. And I think when people say it, they say it with all good intention, and I don't necessarily relate anything negative to it. Although I think there can be usages of it that are very strange and don't really accord with my experience. But my general experience with yoga and meditation, and having studied it, I think a considerable bit deeper and more academically than a lot of people, is largely very pragmatic in orientation, and almost like the spiritual stuff is more like trappings to get people in the door. But then like the core of much of the teaching, in my opinion, is incredibly pragmatic and, something that I think everybody could benefit from. And I think it's a shame when people are put off by it because they feel like they're going to have to do something very spiritual. And I think what they think that means is they're going to have to talk about their feelings with other people or something like that. I think that's the ultimate in bothering people, is like that they'd have to talk about their specific feelings and what led to those feelings, which I guess is just very embarrassing for people. And I can understand that. And that's also why I don't do that in my workshops. I don't want to put people in a situation where they feel like they might be embarrassed or judged or something like that. Like, I mean, however your mind got to where it is, that is where it is. And we're going to deal with it as is. Like, but knowing also, exactly how it got there may not be that helpful. And I feel like, I don't know. I think spirituality often becomes some sort of weird I feel like it's some weird leverage point that people use to kind of manipulate people into strange
Yes.
things, but I
Yeah.
don't. So I'm not really crazy about the word in that regard.
That's what I was about to say. I mean, all the reasons why people will, recoil sometimes at the use of
Mm.
that word are often validated if you go when you
Yeah.
go and walk through a new age bookstore,
Yeah. Sure.
and the egregious amount of bullshit that's there.
Yeah.
And in my time of spending time with those people, I would see people who would then exploit that and as quote unquote spiritual teachers.
Hmm.
And the thing I always notice about those people is the audience. The people that came to see him were oftentimes really, suffering from, they
Yes.
lost a child or some horrible
Hmm.
thing, and so often I just felt they were being exploited. So
Oh yeah.
I think that a lot of the negative connotations are well earned there.
Yes.
When I use the term, I don't use the term, but when discussing in a context like this, and very often I think this is where it can get tricky too. Other people use the term, they're talking about consciousness.
Sure.
So ultimately what we're talking about is we're talking about different states of consciousness, which could very well be a scientific conversation, and you don't have to
Hmm.
invoke anything spiritual or any personal deities or Hindu gods
Sure.
or afterlife or anything else like that.
Mm.
And of course, you and I both know if you go back to the Upanishads or even the original teaching of the Buddha, they're not talking about afterlives and things like that. We're talking about consciousness
Right.
and happiness. But
so I actually have something funny to put in there, like
yeah,
just a funny thing on the tract of like Hinduism or something like that. In like the Rig Veda, it's all about achieving Svarga, like heaven, like very similar to like a Judeo-Christian sort of conceptualization or a Zoroastrian type conceptualization. And somewhere in that period, roughly around the Buddha's time period, like, and it may just be like the Aryans mixing with local people and stuff like that, and
right.
having more encounters with like shamanistic faiths and things like that. But it was considered more, my understanding always that was considered more of like a shocking and detrimental revelation that reincarnation is the truth of things, and that you will not have your permanent svarga, you will not have your permanent heaven. And this was considered a concern because of the very strong reality that life is sort of flawed and is suffering at its very nature or whatever. And so it's like, oh no, like you're really gonna have to bear down and figure out a way out of this thing. Like you're really gonna have to figure out a way out of suffering, because even death won't let you out of suffering, was kind of like the revelation of sorts, which I always found very interesting, because I think most people read it the other way,
Yeah.
as like, oh great, I get another shot or whatever. But more the thinking of those people at the time, I would say, would be more like, oh no, you've got to do this again, like in a Groundhog's Day sort of way. Like, like it's
Go
like,
get your act together.
yeah. So until you get your act together, you're going to have to go through Groundhog's Day again and again. It's just going to be the same old, and the heartbreak and the crushing loss of loved ones over and over again and in perpetuity. And that's kind of, that's where like, people read into the past without actually reading about the past and make assumptions based on how they would think of it. But it always is good to go back to sources and start to understand how they thought about it. All that stuff, though, for me is pretty like, it's just not like, I'm very empirical. So like, if you're gonna ask me if meditation will help me with reincarnation, it's like, how the hell would I know? Like, I don't know. Like I have no way of like verifying that. I know it'll help me with my life today, but I don't know. I'll have to die and come and remember coming back to let you know that, but I don't have that memory and I don't remember, so I can't help you. Sorry. Like, yeah.
There are some of the Upanishads which predate most of that I've read that could just as easily have been written by an atheist.
I agree. Sure.
And so there's also a heavy skeptical component that flows through there of skepticism and questioning everything. Very, almost scientific, considering we're talking about what, more than 2,500 years ago in the case of that literature. But going back to what you're talking about, so you articulated something that would be useful for everybody all the time, being able to get a better handle on your emotions and being able to navigate that world. How specifically, so we're connecting this specifically to fighting and jujitsu.
Mm,
And
sure.
in the book, I mention it because a clear and present state of awareness is one of the best means of self-defense you can have. You don't want to be
Totally.
walking around lost in thought and paranoid, and
Hmm.
paranoia and that kind of thing is the actual opposite of mindfulness. So I
Hmm.
was speaking in a very generic term about the
Hmm.
practical application of that mindset.
Hmm.
But for someone who's been training jujitsu and they're focused on, maybe they want to compete in jujitsu, or maybe even some of the guys on the MMA team that are going to get in a
Hmm.
cage and things like that, what specifically would you say to them as far as, here's why I think you, well, first of all, what should they do? You do a session in the morning, session in the afternoon, and then
Hmm.
second of all, how is that going to help me in my next fight or my next tournament?
Okay, I can think of a couple. If you really wanted to just be pretty practical about applying it, I
Yeah.
think again, I like that. What is it? Perfect is the enemy of good.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you chose to meditate before practice. The benefit would be you're more present. You're going to find it easier to learn the new technical prowess that you're trying to take on. You're going to feel more energy and energetic to take on whatever physical training you might be doing. Conversely, if let's say your schedule only allowed you to do it after practice, well, doing it after practice would fit in with, I think, a lot of the current, like now there's a lot of science coming to like back up stuff that I just experienced, but I experienced these things for years and just I felt them as correct because it was my experience. But now I feel like there's a lot of like science that's backing it up. But like there's the idea of like micro rests or something like that. I think it's referred to. But like if you learn something and then you just basically close your eyes afterwards for even as little as like 10 seconds, I think your brain starts replaying what it just learned like 10 times faster, practicing basically the signals that constitute the neural network that you've built. That's what learning is the construction of a neural network. And yeah, I mean, I found that when I was a university student in particular, it's like I'd meditate after classes and it's like my retention of knowledge went way up. Like if I had meditated right after class, if you meditate before a class is easier, like it's good either way. Like a lot of times I really like that, perfect is the enemy of good stuff. Cause if I tell someone that, it'll make class easier, oh, well, my schedule won't let me meditate before class. So I won't do it at all.
Right.
It's like, okay, or you could just do it after class. Oh, but people are always trying to find that way to not do it. But that would be huge benefits right there. Beyond just from my perspective with jujitsu, I mean, as a jujitsu coach, the main skill that I'm trying to make a white belt acquire is the ability to relax,
Mm-hmm.
to the ability to, and I do think what we're asking people to do is almost bonkers in some level. Like, like someone comes into the gym and you're like, hey, look, after a certain period of time of training, it's like, I'm going to have you wrestle around with Jake here, and he's going to attempt to choke you and
Right.
break your arm. But
I need
hey,
you to stay
Ted,
relaxed.
hey, Ted, could you just relax about that? Like
Yeah.
when he goes to choke you, you should totally relax. And
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, he's trying to choke me. It's like, yeah, yeah. But I mean, yes, you have the part of it is teaching people, all you're going to have to do is tap.
Right.
But even still, it's a very counterintuitive idea.
Mm-hmm.
And definitely meditation, I think, helps people get to that relaxation faster of like, because you start to see that this gets into a bigger concept. I think for a lot of people, they believe that they don't want stress, like they believe that they have an antagonistic relationship with stress, so they want less of it. That I don't believe that's entirely correct. I mean, I think they think that. I'm not disagreeing that they would say that or that's how they express themselves. But I think a more interesting point here, as I see it, and I think maybe this came from living in Korea and just seeing type A people sort of all the time. Most people are actually, in my opinion, kind of addicted to stress. They want to be stressed out. Like you are reminding yourself of problems to get a little jolt of adrenaline and get yourself kind of worked up so that you have additional energy to overcome your task. Um, and the problem with that is like you're using adrenaline for stuff like calling Uber or like just finishing a book or like you're not using adrenaline in a way that is sort of intended to be used. It's sort of intended to be used for like kind of big events.
Right.
And you don't have infinite adrenaline. Like your adrenal glands get depleted. Like adrenal fatigue is a real thing for a lot of people. And it's because they're, in my opinion, kind of juicing themselves up. They're just like, they're hitting like a switch in their mind by sending a negative signal in their brain. The body responds the only way it knows, which is to like charge up. And so, like they're getting ready for a fight sort of, and there's no fight. It's just like waiting in line at a supermarket, or, like they're just like, oh my God, I got to get through this. I have that test tomorrow. And so they're like, there's a good feeling that comes with stress. Like that's why people start doing it. But over time, as you chronically use those systems, you just like deplete them. They're no longer working. And when something truly bad happens, a lot of people, in some sense, how to describe that, they got nothing. They don't have anything when a big thing happens. They're about to get in a car accident. They just completely lock up and freeze up because there's no adrenaline in the tank to come in and give them those quicker responses and give them the responsiveness that they want. Whereas something that I've noticed is from both from meditating and jiu-jitsu combined, that when I'm like about to get in like a very dangerous situation, like I'll be driving on the Texas highways, which are pretty dangerous here, and all of a sudden, like, there's like a wreck and like people slam on the brakes. I got a big, you've seen my white van, that's that big heavy Chevy Express. I mean, that thing doesn't break quickly. And I've had to brake and like change 3-4 lanes or something like that to not kill the cars in front of me with my giant metal van. And I'll have, and like when I go into that, it is matrixy, I would say. Like I really feel like I'm able to think quite quickly in that moment. I'm very responsive, and I'll navigate it. And then, maybe traffic resumes. And I'm often a little surprised by how not bothered I am. Like I'll have a residual thought that like, that was really close. And that was actually super dangerous. And like some people could have died, or that could have been really bad. And I'm like, And I'm not very disturbed by it. I'm not very bothered by it. And I think it's because I have a relatively healthy relationship with my nervous system, so much so that when I'm forced into like, I'm triggered, so to speak, in the modern parlance, like I'm like by something significant, the trigger mechanism fires all the chemicals and all of that kind of stuff. It all fires appropriately. And when I pass through the situation, I'm just passed through the situation. Like I'm not lingering on it. I'm not bothered by it. Whereas my experience, I don't want to sound judgy, but I do see people go through like a similar experience, and it seems to just utterly shake them. And I think what is shaking them is the nervous system was already depleted, and now it's just been taxed many times over its limit. And I'm 100% a believer that you can just have your nervous system taxed beyond its capacity. Like, I mean, I think that's I'm sure what like kind of PTSD and all these kinds of things. I mean, like, I think a thing I learned through yoga and meditation is to absolutely not view your mind as invulnerable, and to be particularly smart about your emotions and where you hang your hat, and where you kind of put yourself into, because you can beat up your mind for sure. And it doesn't heal any easier than your body does, like, so, if you do hard sparring with your body every day, your body will break down. If you go to war emotionally with people like every single day, your mind doesn't heal any faster than your body would heal from like getting thrown down a flight of stairs. So like all that healing is going to take time. And so generally speaking, don't put yourself in those situations if you can, because recovery is not a matter of just telling yourself that it's all better, or like, a little like, oh, forget about it kind of attitude. That's what everyone will say, but that's not something you'll follow through with. It's like saying, if I got thrown down a flight of stairs and I'm all banged up and I'm bruised and my body's not working, and someone's like, well, just forget about it. Like, like, okay, I mean, I will, but I'm not functioning properly and I can't walk up the stairs properly. So I can forget about it all I want, but it's not going to heal that in any sort of immediate sense. So
that's interesting. That's an interesting theory. Talking about technical application, the physical techniques, I think a lot of people, when they think about meditation, and when I've had
Mhm.
conversations with people about it, they have a misnomer that comes from a lot of different places, in particular, a lot of the really bad, quote unquote, spiritual literature,
Mm.
that what they're trying to do is reach a state where their thinking stops.
Yes.
And then most meditation coaches and instructors that I've seen will say instead, it's more of a sense of mindfulness. It's not that you're not you're ceasing thought, that's
Mm.
not necessarily even possible, but rather you're not attached to the thoughts, and you
Right.
can
Right.
watch them go by and not, and let them go, and not be
Mhm.
clinging to them, which, and I imagine the part of you that's clinging to them, which is what you've been speaking towards to a degree, is emotional.
Yeah.
Right? This is why we're hanging on to those thoughts.
Yeah.
But am I correct in that it's the second one, that you're not trying to control your brain, you're more trying to not be attached to what's going on in your brain as a means of
Mhm.
personal identity?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, that's just the idea of like total cessation of thought. Like that's going to be the annihilation of thought is not a possibility.
Mhm.
Like I don't think that's a reasonable possibility. By the time you become cognizant of the fact that thoughts have been annihilated, there will be a thought. The
Right.
thought is, boy, those thoughts were really gone there. So I don't know how that but you are through various methods slowing down thoughts to a certain degree. Although there's going to be days where you meditate and you might have a lot of thoughts. That is, there may just be a lot in the mind space. I have a simple way of talking about this that even someone just listening to this right now will get a taste of meditation without having to stop, close their eyes, or do anything. But when you are, and this will get abstract real quick, but what is a thought exactly? Just starting to ponder that just a little bit, like, where is it exactly? Like, we have an idea that it happens in our head or something, but I wouldn't say you exactly experience it that way. You experience it in a so much more nebulous manner of you know that they're there. Like you have no doubt that there are thoughts. Like no one would doubt the existence of thought who has thought. But trying to locate it is a little bit complicated, except to say that it happens in the space of the mind, which we could think of as sort of like a dimension. Like it doesn't seem to be physical reality that thoughts occur within the dimension that we think of as physical reality where there's matter. I'm not saying that it doesn't, or like maybe we'll discover something later. I'm talking about our experience right now, which is I experience a field that we think of as the mind. And within that field, I experience thoughts and I experience emotions and sensations and sounds and et cetera, et cetera. But that space in which it occurs, I can also be aware of just that space, that there is space between thoughts and there is space between emotions. And I often describe meditation as exploring that space. The feelings and thoughts will be there, but I'm going to experience, and it brings on, let's say, maybe like a heady kind of sensation when I start talking about it that way. Like you're starting to be aware now more of the space that happens between my words, between your thoughts, between your feelings, your sensations. And that is consciousness, so to speak. If we want to try to put a label there, pure consciousness or something. I don't think the labels are as important as digging into that experience. And a lot of what I do on the weekend is showing you ways to, for lack of a better verb, travel into that space, to start exploring that space and giving a little more attention to that space that we typically don't. We tend to explore the contents that swirl within that space, but instead we start to draw our attention to the space itself. Mm-hmm. And that is where the reset begins to happen, because that space is the core. It is the ground of our experience. It is is what underpins every possible experience. That is awareness, right? So, and that's why it creates reset, is because it is what underpins everything. Instead of looking at the results of the software or something like that, we are now going down to just the kind of when the operating system boots up or whatever, we're going to that blank and no command has been given yet. Okay, we're looking between the commands, sort of. So that's a way of describing it. And often I find that just describing that gives people a bit of an experience. They're like, oh yeah, I have not. And even if you never come to the workshop or whatever, I would just encourage you to sometimes let yourself drift into the space between thoughts and feelings. That is meditation at its simplest. I'll kind of teach you ways to do it so that you can do it in a more sustained way. I like what Sam Harris was talking about, actually. I really like that analogy of like it takes a little while to get the fire going, and all of a sudden you're just kind of blowing it out or whatever. Versus like if you do something deeper, you are actually keeping the fire burning for a while. And that is more profound. And that is kind of what I offer on the weekend. You could be someone who's meditated a lot and you would still benefit a great deal just from being kind of locked into this experience of the way I structure the course is it's kind of like scuba diving. We're going to go and we're going to dive deep into consciousness. And out of necessity, when you hit those reset buttons, you'll come back up. It's just a necessity. It's the way the mind works. This is just, people have learned this from years and years of meditation, that you're going to go down and you're going to come back up. It's just what's going to happen. And when you come back up, we're going to kind of do some stretching, kind of help your body relax and stuff like that. We're going to go back down. Then you're going to come back up. That's just the natural part of it. And we're going to kind of loosen you up, relax you a little bit. We're going to go back down. Like that is what the workshop is just repeatedly finding the way back down. And by the end of it, it's like you will have, when you go back down, you kind of, you bring a lot of that core stuff back up to the surface with you. And that core stuff, it really equates to kind of like a feeling of being rejuvenated, a feeling of enthusiasm, I think would be one of the better words to use there, like feeling kind of hopeful, optimistic, like driven, like basically rekindling passion, like that's, I think, what Sam is talking about, like the Vipassana type stuff, all very cool. I respect all that stuff. And, that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve in a sort of shorter, more, I don't want to sound antagonistic towards them or something. I think what Vipassana does is great, although I do think it's sort of heroic and sort of very challenging for people. The way I learned it from Lloyd is there are sort of old practices of meditation where you're really just like alone with your mind for 9 hours a day or something like that, and like no instruction and all of that. And yes, that's cool. Like, yes, that produces results. But it's, to me, I guess to use like a jiu-jitsu analogy, it's kind of like 9 hours of sparring would produce some technical advancement, but also you could learn from people who someone might teach you that in 9 minutes too, like, and be able to help you along. So I'm providing the role of teaching you in 9 minutes what you might have to take you 9 hours to figure out about your mind and how it responds to certain things. So it's like, I'll give you the fundamentals to move forward, and you don't have to grind your way through to get to that experience. You can get that experience in a shorter, more compact way. I really like an analogy from my teacher, Lloyd, years ago. He said, the old practices of traveling to the inner space were kind of like NASA's first attempts to go to space. They're crude. We don't seek to recreate the same rockets. We've improved the rockets. We have actually commercial flight to space or whatever. Like, we try to make it more accessible. We don't try to just retain the challenge aspect unnecessarily. So I think over 2,500 years, people have refined these processes dramatically to make it more and more accessible. And that is what modern yoga is trying to make the delving into inner space accessible enough that you could live a normal life and still get a lot from meditation. Whereas in the past, it was sort of like you could not live a normal life and get much from meditation, because you're gonna we don't know how to access it quickly, so you're gonna have to like sequester yourself and just like no distractions, just be like completely in this thing, which has its own value, but like it was a process of learning how to bring that experience to the common person. That is the development of yoga and meditation and everything. And it's like any technical field, it gets better over time. It doesn't get sort of worse over time. That would not really make that much sense. Although I suppose there's some fields where maybe that happened in some small way, but yeah.
That's interesting. And so for people who aren't going to be able to look, so this is going to be in October, first weekend in October in Portland. Everybody's invited that wants to come do it, but we're also filming it. You're going to be doing the first ever video series that we've ever done on that. What's a video series on meditation look like? What can they expect?
I mean, there will be a lot of times where the video will be recording me, but I don't know that you'll want to be looking at me.
Right.
You'll probably have your eyes closed and stuff like that. So yeah, the video series, I'm sure will just be it'll be very accessible.
Okay.
Basically, like you'll be able to take components of it and utilize the extent to which you have available at that time. Like, if you want to do 20 minutes, we'll do 20 minutes. If you have the time to slot out, maybe you could do like a couple hours or something on your own, following the guidance that I'm laying down through the video structures and stuff like that. So that's basically going to be my goal, is to make it something that is super practical, that you can just plug and play, basically. Like, I mean, there's a lot of meditation apps and things like that already. All great stuff. I'm very much just like, when someone comes to me and says, hey, I do this app or I do that app, great is the response. I don't try to nitpick it or whatever. I'd rather see people doing stuff than not doing stuff. So if you ask me for a recommendation, then I might have a different opinion, but yeah.
So before we go, somebody's watching this now and they're convinced from listening to you talk that this is something that they want to start to do. Between now and the time that they get your video series, or now and the time they come to the workshop, or now and the time they go somewhere else and get meditation instruction, they wanted to start tomorrow morning. What would be the simple instructions you would give somebody to get a taste for this?
Oh yeah. A simple thing that they could do right away, in my opinion, would be, I'm a little reticent always to start doing like a guided meditation over something like this, just because some people are usually driving, and I don't want them to start to drift off or something. Like, and
maybe just a general idea of what it would look like.
Sure. I would say find a little time during the day when you don't think you'd be bothered by other people. Although don't make it too big of a deal. Sit by yourself. And I would recommend sitting up more than laying down, just because laying down is going to lead you to a little bit more of a nappish, sleepish type state of mind, which is, again, not a problem. But I do meditate laying down sometimes. But you're new to this thing, so it might be better to start in a more standard thing. It doesn't have to be sitting cross-legged. You can just sit in a regular chair, if whatever is comfortable for you. I want you to be very comfortable. I want your back to be relatively upright. You're going to start breathing through your belly, and
like you're doing jiu-jitsu where you're breathing in low here.
Absolutely, yeah. And then I'm just trying to think of what's the simplest thing I would say is like make your breathing as long and as slow as possible, and just focus on doing that for like 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and every time you find your mind start to drift off into something else, which it will, you haven't failed. It's just like I talked about. You went a little deep and then you'll come back up. It's going to be a natural part of the process. When you become cognizant of the fact that you're not being aware of your breathing anymore, which is very natural, you will just take your attention without self-judgment back to your breathing and just start the process again. And it is probably good to maybe start with a timer of like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. When the timer goes off, just get up and go. But, the breathing by itself will just relax you. Just notice, like, when you breathe in, there is a sense of energy that comes with breathing in.
Mm-hmm.
And when you breathe out, there's a sense of relaxing, and there's a feeling of peace that comes when you breathe out. So you're just alternating between these two states of energy and peace. That's it. And just kind of enjoy it. Don't try to stop any thoughts. Don't try to stop any feelings. But also don't take it as a time to plan things. Like, okay, now I'm going to sit here for 10 minutes and plan things in my mind. My goal when I sit down is going to be as focused just on the feeling of breathing as much as I can. And that'll, because if when you try to tell your thoughts to stop, it doesn't work very well. Versus if you direct your consciousness to other markers, that's not so hard to do. That's not so challenging. And usually your thoughts will diminish in total quantity as a result of putting your focus on something else. So does that make sense?
It makes sense. And what's interesting about that last weekend before last, I was in LA and I had the opportunity to go visit with Hickson.
Mm.
And it was just Chris Howder, myself, and Ray and Marco, and Hickson was there. And he went in an impromptu lecture for about an hour on exactly what you're talking about, and on breathing, and on breathing slow, and what it does for you, and how important it was. And he is absolutely adamant that that is the single most important thing. That's the single most important secret to his success during his fighting career. We talked to him about it. And then he demonstrated his breathing. He would raise his hand up as he inhaled and lower his hand as he exhaled, and it was very slow. I mean, I was impressed watching him do it. Yeah, so for anybody else there that's, like, what does this have to do with jiu-jitsu? I mean, well, it's just the greatest jiu-jitsu player in the world seems to think it has a lot to do with it.
Right, yeah. He's very involved in yoga and meditation type stuff from what I got reading his book. So yeah. I'm still excited to potentially maybe meet Hickson at some point here. I would love
I'm sure you will. Well, this has been awesome, Michael. I appreciate it. I'm excited for your class. And for those who are just watching us and don't live here in Oregon, we're going to put together a video series so they can pick it up later. And,
awesome.
And we will put your personal information on your contact information on this podcast underneath us here on YouTube for people who want to reach out to you if they have any more questions.
Sounds good.
And I appreciate it. I'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.